This is The Conspiracy of Man, a video series about Jesus the man. Not Jesus the Christ or anointed God of Christian myth, but Jesus the man, who he actually was and what he actually did. The Conspiracy of Man is a story about the Essene conspiracy to bring down the temple using Jesus to fulfill the laws of the blood sacrifice, ancient laws ostensibly established by Moses with Yahweh. By offering himself up as the final blood sacrifice of the Paschal lamb, Jesus brought into question the entire sacrificial system. This is video 8 in the Conspiracy of Man series, a video about blood. It's all about blood, sacrificial blood, the blood of the lamb, the blood of racial purity. The Bible is steeped in blood. We will commence this study by examining the foundation of the system that produced Torah law. Warning: some may consider the points covered here to be controversial or graphically distasteful. Long before the Second Temple came the corrupt system, a primitive priesthood used to sustain itself. However, the system had one glaring drawback. It was based on a freely available substance used to confirm the sinner had made proper atonement. Cain and Abel set the legal precedence of the meat sacrifice over the grain sacrifice. The story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac set the legal precedence for substituting an animal sacrifice for child sacrifice. Under Torah law, all children belong to Yahweh, the God who commanded blood sacrifice for a child's redemption. As intercessors for their tribal God, priests took legal possession of children in the name of Yahweh and then demanded animal sacrifice to redeem them. A firstborn son was a crucial figure in the Jews' ancient agrarian culture, as a son meant an increase in productivity. Therefore, a son was well worth the sacrificial redemption set by Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. The Torah refers to the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy are Levirate laws forming the basis for ancient Judaism's sacrificial system. The foundational principle behind the system is found in Leviticus chapter 17 verse 11, which states, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your soul, for it is the blood that maketh atonement for the soul." This principle is again readily apparent in the description of the original 10 Commandments smashed by Moses before being replaced by Yahweh in the form of the second Decalogue, a set of commandments pertaining to sacrificial minutiae. Like many primitive cultures, ancient Judaism was naturally founded on the sacrifice of blood offerings in the form of specified animals and non-blood offerings in the form of specified grains. What is notable are the items that, while taxed, were outside the sacrificial system's circus of slaughter. The true purpose of the ancient tabernacle's ritual slaughter of animals was to feed and sustain the priesthood, who took 10% of the choicest cuts of meat from their followers' best animals culled from their herds. The fat and viscera was then burned on the altar as sweet savor to the Lord. The remaining meat was then returned to the sinner. Think about this for a moment. Yahweh preferred the entrails to the prime cuts commanded by the priests. The tabernacle was in fact a portable abattoir with priests serving as butchers. Therefore, priests had a deeply vested interest in making sure the sacrificial tribute was paid to them. To ensure their sacrificial demands had been met, priests developed the blood marking as visible proof. Revenue had been collected on time, every time. Imagine for a moment your priest as a butcher. Imagine going to church on Sunday and seeing your priest, pastor, or reverend at the altar slitting the throat of parishioners' pets, catching their blood in a golden bowl, and then splashing it around the altar as he dances around in a trance-like state, chanting pleas to God for the forgiveness of sins while begging for salvation. After the service, you might say to your spouse, "Boy, that certainly was a different sermon this week, wasn't it, dear?" Your spouse replies, "Oh, I don't know. Next week is communion, when we eat the body of Christ and drink his blood." The prohibition of contact with blood, or any potential source for it, is described repeatedly throughout Old Testament law and the later Mishnah. The reason for this prohibition was a desperate attempt to control the blood for the marking so it could not be counterfeited. In fact, if one reads the Mishnah, they will find all manner of prohibition against possessing butchering implements, along with vessels that could hold blood. Essentially, the idea was, when butchering knives are outlawed, only butchers will have knives. Under Judaism's religious law, the dead body, a prime receptacle for blood, is considered the most unclean or illegal thing of all. Therefore, contact with anyone producing blood was proscribed by laws that prohibited contact with anyone exhibiting bloody emissions, like lepers and menstruating women. Because of this prohibition, it was never acknowledged by the priests that in their crazed bloodlust they would drink the blood of the animal in the same way many primitive people drink the blood of a powerful animal or enemy in the belief it imparts that power to the blood drinker. Time and customs moved on to money being accepted as a sacrificial proxy, but old, profitable habits die hard. Thus, first-century temple priests continued their ancient sacrificial tradition that had been recognized by their followers for centuries as the only way to atone for one's sins. Today, the faithful open up their wallets. The blood for the marking was obtained by slitting the animal's throat and letting the still-living heart pump the blood onto the ground to ensure the blood drained as completely as possible. This was the beginning of the kosher slaughter. Yet, blood by itself does not provide a stable form of marking, as it cracks and flakes off after it dries. You have no doubt experienced this after receiving a cut that bled profusely and then dried. However, when blood is mixed with other bodily fluids, it can be made into an adequate semi-permanent marking for human skin. To facilitate the marking process, a portion of blood would be caught in a golden bowl and then mixed with semen to create a semi-permanent mark as visible proof the sinner had paid their sacrificial sin tax. The marking was applied to the forehead or big toe, go figure. Immediately prior to the next sacrifice, the blood mark would be washed off in the mandatory mikvah ritual purification bath. Then the sacrificial cycle would begin anew. This marking system, however, had one obvious, glaring drawback. Blood is a commonly available substance produced by all higher organisms. In their attempt to control the easily counterfeited blood marking, priests forbade their followers from butchering their own animals or even possessing the instruments for doing so. This was the primary reason for the kosher slaughter. This led to the prohibition of various implements and practices used in the butchering process. Thus, the priests defined knives and other implements used for butchering, owned by those outside the priesthood, as unclean or illegal, as these legalistic dictates have nothing to do with hygiene. As a result, a Byzantine legal structure arose to control the minutiae of everyday life. There is a forgettable tract in the Mishnah that elaborates at length on the cleanliness of a bowl. The upshot of this legal commandment is that if a bowl is intact, then it is unclean. But if the bowl is smashed into pieces of which the largest piece is no larger than the tip of a man's little finger, then it is clean. Wait a minute. If the bowl is intact, then it is unclean or illegal. However, if the bowl is reduced to tiny, useless shards, then it is legal or clean. This makes absolutely no sense unless one understands the bowl in question can be used to hold and mix blood products, as was the case with the priest's golden bowl. Later, the phylactery, or tefillin, replaced the blood marking. This is a small box strapped to the forehead or the back of the wrist, holding a scroll with a passage from the Torah. The scroll changed in accordance with the sacrificial cycle, and, like tabs on a license plate, it could be checked as proof that temple followers were current on their sacrificial tribute. For the priest, it was just good business. Despite this modification, the laws concerning blood products remained in full force. I want you to sit back now, close your eyes, and listen to the following description. Imagine yourself as a very young child of a primitive, nomadic tribesman. Having heard only stories, you are dimly aware of the importance of a much-talked-about, upcoming ritual. You are aware this ritual occurs on a regular basis, and the anxiousness of your parents is palpable when discussing the subject. On the prescribed day, preparation for the ritual begins. You follow your parents down to a running stream. A man richly attired in strange garb stands in the middle of the stream. One by one, your neighbors walk into the stream where the man mutters strange words as he immerses them in the water while rubbing their forehead with the palm of his hand. After your father has undergone the ritual immersion, you note the red mark he always wears on his forehead has disappeared. The ritual continues until every adult in the village has undergone immersion. You hear someone nearby whispering that the sacred cycle has ended. The following day, your mother wakes you earlier than usual, and your family spends the morning in careful preparation for the day's activities. You want to play with your friends, but your mother insists you attend to her demands. Later that afternoon, you accompany your father as he goes out among his meager collection of animals. He spends quite a bit of time inspecting the herd until he finally chooses a prized sheep. This animal happens to be one of your favorites. You have often played with the sheep, chasing them around the meadows, and finally catching one, you buried your face in its soft wool. Your nose takes delight in the earthy smell of the sheep. It is the smell of life, and life seems to be everywhere among the hills where the herds roam. The next morning, your father takes you by the hand, and with animal in tow, you are dragged to the portable slaughterhouse your parents referred to as the tabernacle. Here you are to witness the horrible spectacle of the important ritual they have been discussing over the preceding weeks. You enter a large enclosure surrounded by a fence made of cloth. In the middle of the enclosure is an odd tent-like structure with rude wooden columns and entry doors. A number of well-attired men await in the makeshift courtyard directly in front of the tent. Soon, other families begin arriving with their animals. Finally, the ceremony begins. A priest blows a ram's horn called a shofar to call out sinners. A neighbor of yours steps forward and presents a prized calf to one of several strangely dressed men, like the men you saw at the stream the day before. Your parents refer to these men as Kohen. One by one, the sinners step forward and present their animal to a priest who carefully inspects the animal to assure a healthy condition before wrestling it to the ground. Your neighbor drops to his knees in front of the priest, who closes his eyes and begins chanting something unintelligible. As you witness this strange act, your turn at the slaughter arrives. Your father grabs your hand and places it alongside his on your favorite, prized sheep. You feel its heart racing. The animal's terror is clearly transmitted through the palm of your hand. The priest takes hold of the struggling animal and with quick, practiced motion slits its throat with a razor-sharp knife. The animal struggles, kicking and bellowing in protest, as a geyser of blood erupts from its carotid artery. The froth of blood spews forth, splattering you and everyone present. You feel the spark of life draining through its hide as the stillness of death overcomes the animal. You look down at the viscous red fluid splattered on the front of your robe. You stare with revulsion at the red stains soaking into the fibers as the stench of death assaults your nostrils and addles your senses. Even before the animal has ceased struggling, you look up from your blood-stained robe to see the priest, butcher, moving quickly to catch the animal's blood in a golden bowl. With eyelids half closed and muttering some strange incantation, he seems to be in a trance. Shouting, he lifts the golden bowl skyward at arm's length before splashing the rapidly congealing blood over and around the base of the flaming altar. The priest then comes out of his trance and begins eviscerating the animal. During this process, the animal's bloody viscera are thrown upon the altar, where they are incinerated as sweet savor to a god that evidently has an abiding taste for burnt fat and viscera. In just a few strokes, the priest-butcher finishes his gory task. Working rapidly, he begins cutting the animal's joints. As he separates the portions of meat, he carefully lays aside a large portion of the best cuts for himself. He then returns the remaining meat to the sinner, who by now has given the priest full admission of his sins. With the sacrifice complete, the priest produces a golden bowl with a cup full of the animal's blood swimming in the bottom. He mixes it with a thick, translucent fluid that looks like semen. He uses his fingers to smear a large daub of the mixture on the forehead of the entranced chanting sinner kneeling before him with closed eyes. Then, with a loud shout, the priest declares that by this act, all sins have been atoned. Your neighbor staggers to his feet and, like a beatific drunk, lurches away from the gory remains of what had been a living, breathing creature moments before. Eviscerated animal remnants swim in a pool of blood rapidly absorbing into the dirt, even as the priest calls for the next sinner to step forward with his animal. Suddenly you feel the full emotional horror of the fate awaiting the other animals brought to the ritual. All the while these men called CoM howl, chant, and dance about, reciting their ritualistic incantations, begging God's forgiveness. It was an extremely gruesome spectacle. The bloodlust continues well into evening. What you never witness is the secret ceremony that takes place inside the tabernacle's tent, where the high priest, in a final act of crazed bloodlust, drinks the sacrificial blood before the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. This ceremony is later replicated during the Last Supper when Jesus, the sacrificial paschal lamb, sardonically tells his disciples, "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood will have eternal life. Take this bread, this is my body. Drink this wine, this is my blood. Do this in remembrance of my ultimate sacrifice to the temple." This act is bitter mimicry of what the priests have been doing for millennia. The Levirate injunction against blood products is a public admonishment to restrict contact with blood products. However, the Kohanim exempted themselves from their own laws and secretly did not observe such restrictions. Again, this covert priestly act of drinking blood, along with the acceptable act of consuming sacrificial meat, is replayed by Jesus during the Last Supper. A few days later, the priests would fold their tabernacle tent, and their circus of horror would move on to the next tribe where the sacrificial cycle will be played out once again. Consider the effect on a young child witnessing the gruesome spectacle of regular, repeated, sacrificial bloodlust. Blood spewing everywhere from slashed carotid arteries, chanting priests, crazed by bloodlust. Excited by the sound of howling, grunting animals bleeding out the last of their life on the ground. The restless bleating of animals, now aware of their terrible fate. Sinners raising their hands towards the heavens as they cry out for God's mercy and forgiveness. Imagine your parents continually consumed with the thought of blood and the avoidance of the sticky substance, thoughts that translate into an unnatural obsession with sacrificial law. Extrapolate this horror out over the generational millennia, and one finds an ancient religion founded and imbued with the horrors of a culturally inbred religion based on ritual slaughter. This was the religion Jesus and his Essene brethren conspired to destroy. This is why, to this day, Judaism maintains a vehement hatred towards not Jesus, the Christ of religion, but Jesus, the man who destroyed their first central bank, the Second Temple. Note: while video and audio contain AI elements, script content is completely human-generated. There is no AI-generated script or script editing included in the narration.